All right. Well, welcome to our attendees to the Rising Pressure to Secure Enrollments, Preventing Burnout in 2023. And this is a topic that is very, very timely. You used to be almost could guarantee that you're going to bring in your class, and those days are well and gone. So we want to make sure that we are covering this topic soup to nuts. And I am your host for today. I am Douglas Carlson. I lead business development and partnerships here at Lead Squared. But by far, there's more important to be on this panel. So pleasure to be the host, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our moderator. And actually, in just a moment, I'll do that. But before we do that, I do want to give a couple pieces about getting started here. First and foremost, as attendees, you are muted. However, that does not mean that you cannot interact and engage. So first, if you're having any trouble with your settings, sound, anything of that nature, if you click the little gear icon for the settings, you can adjust all of those pieces so you have full control there. We also want to give you a heads up that we do have a pop-up poll coming in your screen. So if you'd like to participate, that's a really wonderful way for our moderators and also panelists to be able to interact and just have a more deep and thoughtful conversation based upon you, the attendees. And last but not least, if you do have questions, please pop them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A session at the end. And also if something can be sort of inserted directly into our conversation, we will do that as well. So we're really excited to have our audience participate. But again, more important people than me, let's switch it on over. So Scott, as our moderator, please take it away.
Thanks, Douglas. I'm Scott Rhodes. I am your moderator today. I am the Senior Vice President of Enrollment Consulting at Echo Delta. I have 20 plus years of higher ed experience and 6 years of agency experience. I actually worked at 5 different universities across the country, and I started out as an admissions counselor and worked my way up to Vice Provost, most recently at Florida Polytechnic University. Over that time, I oversaw admissions, financial aid, marketing, and definitely have seen my time of a lot of different stress in the workplace, especially in enrollment. So looking forward to the conversation. Marlon?
Oh,
Corey?
I was waiting for the next person. Sorry. Hi, Marilyn Powell. I'm a psychologist by training, but I work at West Coast University in academic operations. Burnout is, of course, an issue that comes up a lot in sessions with clients and also at the workplace with teams that, particularly admissions teams and other teams who are trying to meet specific goals and have hard deadlines and timelines. So I'm glad to be here.
Corey?
Hi, everybody. My name is Corey Klossman. I currently work as a consultant working with educational nonprofit institutions. I spent the last 8 years up until last year with Ivy Tech Community College in Indiana. Most recently, as the Vice President for Student Success, overseeing traditional student affairs areas, advising, as well as continuing student enrollment. And before that, I was at 2 different four-year universities over 15 years. So pleasure to be with all of that.
Thank you. We did have one more panelist, but he is having technical difficulties, but he may join us as we progress. Today's agenda, first of all, we're going to start out is understanding the source and signs of burnout. Then we're going to talk about reducing workplace stress and how to combat burnout. And then we're going to finally talk about maintaining morale and keeping your team motivated in order to keep and retain employees. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A. To start out, we are really interested in where you guys are at as attendees. And if you could take your time and just complete this quick poll so we could get a feel of where the team is and where most of the stress is for our attendees. And we'll definitely be sharing this as we move through. Thank you. All right. So let's go ahead and start off with our first topic. What do you look for to recognize in your peers or staff are experiencing stress? What are some of those things? Or Marilyn?
One thing I look for is what I think about as anticipatory anxiety, worrying about things that are a little too far down the road. getting kind of caught up in what if this, what if that, thinking beyond current goals or what we can do today to reach goals. So that's, I think, really important for team members to kind of notice when people are starting to future cast a little too much to where they kind of get overwhelmed.
How about you, Corey?
Yeah, and I think that along with that, you tend to see kind of personality changes, I think, in people as well. Either people who tend to be very outgoing tend to keep to themselves more, or aren't necessarily as excited or energetic, or those who just kind of disengaged a little bit, or maybe they're less likely to take time away from the office, either call in sick or take vacation time because they don't feel like they can afford to be away, because if they don't do it, then they're just going to fall further and further behind. And looking for some of those signs, I think one of the more troublesome ones is once you couple people leave, it's usually kind of the dam breaking, and it means that others could leave. So I think that's kind of the ultimate kind of sign that burnout is happening, that you try to nip before.
What tactics do you guys use to identify or recognize stressors in your team? Corey, you want to start with this one?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I always try to do is really build them into regular conversations with my team. So I would usually have either weekly or bi-weekly one-on-ones with my team members, and just ask them kind of how things are going, and just what's on their mind, what are they thinking about, how they feel like their workload is going, and hopefully that over time that works to build up some trust and build that relationship. Because I think people aren't going to talk to you if they don't feel about what's really bugging them, and that they feel burned out if they don't trust you and feel like that you're going to do something to act on it. And so following up and helping to actually take some steps to ease some of that burden, I think, is going to be critical. We had moved to a cycle where we also had quarterly reviews, so not just an annual review, but kind of quarterly check-ins, and adding that as one of the questions of how can we help with burnout or some of the stress and some of your workload. And building that in, so it was things that I could maybe help them do and talk through, but also put some things on me that I could do, and gave me a point to check in with by the next review cycle, and showed that I was concerned and wanting to help.
I think those personal conversations and connections are absolutely critical, and the trust factor is really important. When you notice people are a little edgier than usual or have lost their sense of humor, which I think is one of the biggest indicators of burnout. Having those conversations and being, I don't want to overuse the term, but a safe place to say, this is getting to be too much, and can we problem solve? Keeping it, of course, in the work realm, but okay, how are the hours, and then I think one good question to ask always is, if you could change one thing right now, what would it be? Because that helps you get to the root of what's maybe at the top of their list in terms of contributing to not feeling as good or as engaged.
Yeah, that really leads to our next question: is how do you show empathy towards your staff when you see that they're really under stress?
I think by being human and sharing your stress as well, sometimes not in a way that overwhelms or minimizes theirs, but also talking about the ways that you manage things, or demonstrating, leaving the office, demonstrating taking time and not being on email, gentle reminders to take time, those kind of things. So I think you show empathy by being human, and also, just try it on. I'm sitting and thinking about, gosh, if I were in this situation, how would I feel? And then always asking, it seems like you might be feeling X. Is that right? Because I could be wrong. And I think giving them that space to correct your perception, or to feel like, okay, at least you're either trying to understand how I'm feeling, or you got it right on the money. So I think those kinds of things are important.
Yeah, I think to go along with that, I would say part of it is just acknowledging that they're stressed, and telling them, I hear you. I know this is a stressful time. I know people are burned out. And I think people just need to know that you understand. And I think that goes a long way. I think you need to act on it, but I think just acknowledging it, I think, really helps. I think there's a very important way to ask this question, but I think it's also then asking, how can I help? Which I think is very different than, is there something I can do to help? I think by saying, how can I help, it shows that you are actively involved and engaged in helping them, as opposed to just kind of a general question that they have to think about. It doesn't necessarily just saying, is there anything I can do to help? Sounds like, you know, I feel like I have to ask, but I'm really hoping you don't say anything. So trying to be actively engaged in how you do that. And then I think also asking and determining what motivates people, what is helpful to them during times of stress, figuring out because for every person it's different, whether it's time away from the office, whether it's dedicated time to work on certain tasks, and kind of individualizing that a little bit, knowing that we're all different, I think.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I often would spend time with my managers, and I would always remind them, you never know what's going on personally in someone's life that they're bringing to work. Don't always assume it's something in the workplace that's causing their stress and why they're reacting to you. So, all really good points. All right. How as a leader do you manage the work environment to reduce burnout? Or you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that I've really noticed, particularly I think working with advisors over the last several years, is that email has become a much heavier use of people's times, and students wanting to be advised or have whatever essentially advising meetings over email. And it's not something that people can do easily in between meetings anymore. They're getting more of them and they take a lot longer to respond to. You have to read, you have to get a lot more thoughtful response. And so one of the things that we really pushed was give people dedicated time to respond. So let them block out, maybe it's an hour at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day, sometime when maybe traffic isn't quite as heavy, and it could be staggered between your staff as well. But give them time to actually focus on that and recognize that that is a heavy use of their time right now. I think I've also tried, and I've seen some departments do this fairly well, basically had email free times. So like I've seen some teams say, we are not going to email or send any emails between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. So that way you don't feel like you need to be on email when you're supposed to be on free time. I think it's a meme going around online, but I think it's really tangent, which is don't confuse people's availability with their free time. And I think that's a good way to do that. That just because they're at home doesn't mean that we should expect them to work. And I think one of the things we learned in COVID is that people were always available, and it's almost like we've expected that to work. And I think that has been one of the big ways that has really carried forward as well. And then for advisors in particular, but I think this applies to other areas, is advisors are saying the same things to a lot of students over and over and over again, which becomes redundant. You know, half of any advising session is the same things that you say to every single student. And so things like group advising, where you can take a group of students, say the same thing all at once that applies to every single. That way you only have to say it once, which is a stressor and burnout and causes boredom, frankly. But then allows you less time with each individual student, but more dedicated time to what actually to that. We've found all those things that help, as well as just telling people it's okay and encouraging them to log, take their PTO time when they're sick. Don't expect them to work from home, but just tell them be sick and take care of yourself better, take your vacation time. I think people need that permission and need to know it's okay.
Those are all really important, and I would add meetings. So taking a look at meetings, I noticed during the pandemic, I always worked remotely at my former institution, and some of the business owners worked in the office, and they would meet each other, you know, in the coffee space or on the way to a meeting, and they would have some conversations. And then I would get emails, hey, I caught up with so-and-so and we talked about X. Is that okay with you? When they all went home for the pandemic, all of a sudden there were 30-minute meetings all the time because they weren't having those casual conversations, and they included me in all of them. And so I think we did build through the pandemic a high meeting culture. And I think part of what you're saying, Corey, too, is simplify. Do what you must do, what you need to do to keep people focused on goals, and and certainly from our industry on the students. But if there's anything you cannot do or not do as much, that can really help, because I think one of the key factors I see in burnout is I don't have time to do my work. I'm always in a meeting, or I'm always responding to email. I don't have time. And so I think that's when that kind of folds, because every meeting you may get an action item. Every email has a request. So that's where people start to feel like they don't have time to do what they feel like in some ways they were hired to do.
Next question is, what tactics do you use to combat burnout? I know at my institutions, I always used our CRM. It was a great way to use dashboards. I always had department chairs or deans coming up to me and, where's my program? How are we doing? And so I had a dashboard just for the deans, or I had a dashboard just for the department chairs, or even board members. I had a board dashboard that kept them really high level and not down in the weeds. What tactics do you guys use to help your teams?
I think you're right on point in terms of providing information in digestible chunks instead of having everyone have to hunt for their own. I think if you can get that done, that simplifies things. Also watching time, again, kind of allowing blocked off time and learning to respect the blocked off time on the calendar. Sometimes you have cultures where you may block off time, but you still see meeting requests during that time. And I think really paying attention to, are people spending time casually? Are they, feeling connected at work? Are they doing things that they love to do every day? Are they, checking in and doing those sorts of one-on-ones to make sure that they're it's a two-directional situation. Are they getting out of the job what they want to get out of the job? And so I think all of those things, and then again, modeling, taking time, modeling being sick and not working, all of those things are really important, because the team will look to you to see how you handle it, to understand how they should handle it.
Yeah, I think those are really good. I think the other thing I would add to that is making sure that people that they get up and walk away. So whether that's, inviting them to a lunch every once in a while, or even if it's just to go eat lunch together, or you personally making sure that you get up, and whether it's just to go to the water fountain and get water, or walk to grab lunch somewhere, and encouraging that in the team, and even if it's, and doing it with them, it could even be just to do something to get up and free your mind and clear it and have that reset. I think, because I've definitely noticed more and more people working through lunch, because they feel like they can't afford it. And I think, especially being at home, we were all used to it. And so I think Marilyn's point of modeling it and then also just encouraging it as others as well, I think is really important.
Very good points. Topic. How do you keep morale high with your teams? Corey, you want to take this one?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are a couple of things that immediately came to mind for me. I think one is to jump in and help where I could, even if it's for small things periodically. I think when they know that you're invested and that you want to help, I think it goes a long way to help them. I think as well as they're professionals and they want to be treated as such. And so giving them the autonomy where you can to make decisions that they can, giving them work flexibility. So if they need to adjust their schedule from one day to the next, I think even though a lot of people are back in person, we are still in a lot of Zoom meetings. And so people can schedule a day of all Zoom meetings. Nobody wants to come to the office when they're going to sit on Zoom meetings all day. Let them work from home if they can schedule all Zoom meetings, and just give them that flexibility, because people are just a lot more content, it seems like, when they're at home than when they're in the office. Not for everybody, but for some people, that's a really big motivator. And then I think make sure that that communication loop is in place. Well, I think something that causes a lot of frustration and burnout for people is they feel like they're doing work because they don't know the answer, and they haven't been told a piece of information. So they're hunting, they're doing things that they didn't have to do because the community didn't. And so figure out the best way to just share information with the team, So that way they have all the tools that they.
I think feeling in the know, that's really important. The communication piece is critical to being part of a team. Teams share information and they share, strategies to make things easier and kind of encouraging that among people. I think treating people like professionals is really important. And that also, if you ask what they want, if you survey or you do something like we do with students, make sure you follow up and let them know what you're doing in response, because there's no worse way to contribute to the stress and frustration is to elicit feedback and then not, either not respond or not tell them what you're doing to address it. So I think that's really important to ask them how they feel, what they want, but then deliver.
I think the other thing I'd add that I was thinking about as you're talking, Marilyn, is we know at institutions, August in particular is a crazy time. And at some institutions, depending upon your type and your mission, it can be January as well. Figuring out, what can you do to help your team or recognize your team, whether it's bringing in lunch periodically, or if people need to be out for various reasons, figuring out kind of what that process is for letting people, if they need to be away, let them be away, or to take care of their family, or if they're sick. Just recognizing in some way how chaotic and stressful those few weeks are. Is really helpful. We all know it's coming every year. We're all as prepared as we can be, but it still hits everybody. And so recognize the hard work of during that time, I think is really important too.
Corey, you brought up a good point about remote working, and COVID has changed so much and so many people work from home. What have you done differently, with your teams, or would you recommend that people do with their teams if they have a lot of remote workers?
So I think one of the things, I think to Marilyn's point early on, is we schedule the meetings and we overscheduled meetings, and so figuring out how to schedule that back, how, a lot of emails became meetings, and how to bring those meetings back to email, or how to change them to like the use of Microsoft Teams, or just a quick phone call that way. When things really need to be answered, and recognizing the difference between what do we need to answer immediately, like what needs to be a meeting with a larger discussion, or do I need to talk through face to face, whether in person or virtually, and what could be an email or just a quick message. They have time, I think has been really important, as well as just giving them dedicated time to continue to be remote if that's what they want, whether it's a week or one day every couple of weeks. It's just been really helpful. I think it has met a need and a desire that a lot of employees have had.
Yeah, and I think that we've had to solicit input more strategically, when you're sitting near, or you can walk through with the team, or you can see them, you kind of get that natural idea or input or suggestion or thought, temperature. And I think that we've had to, like I mentioned surveys before, that we've had to start deliberately, asking for the associate voice, how are things rank? Here's some things that we know we're working on. What do you see as a priority? Really getting that engagement piece too, using it as a way of engaging or assessing engagement can be really important. Then again, kind of putting together an action plan from those results, sharing that, and then maybe even talking about or sending out, rather than having a meeting to discuss the progress, but you can send out, bar graphs that show here we are, we're close to, doing this, or this month we did 3 team lunches, or we heard you about this, and so we've changed that. Those kinds of things, I think, help people stay connected because it can be pretty isolating, from being online and being separate. And Zoom fatigue's real, at some point, allowing people to pick a couple of meetings they can be off camera, so that they can stop doing that meta thing where you watch yourself and you're watching your team, because as humans, we can't help it. So I think that can be very exhausting.
Yeah, I work from home full-time remote. And so, even getting up and just walking around, taking the dog for a walk, really helps me out a lot. I have my watch telling me to stand up, and I have a watch. And every time it does that, I get up and I walk around. And my wife actually works from home too. So I walk to the other side of our condo and then just say hello. and check in with her, and that has helped me out tremendously.
It's funny you talk about your dog, because I unintentionally over COVID trained my dog that she needs 5 to 10 minutes of time outside playing fetch, once in the morning and once in the afternoon, because
Yep.
it was my way to get up and walk around. And so now she just lays in my office in the morning until she gets that time, and then we'll go do something until after lunch and then wait again for it. So, but it was my way of getting up and walking away, just to give myself a break.
Yeah, breaking things up through the day.
Well, I know we left a lot of time at the end. Those are the topics that we wanted to run through, but we also wanted to get to our poll. And then so I'll turn this over to Douglas, and he can talk a little bit about those results, and we can get to some Q&A.
Yeah, and I forgive me, I just am too curious with a couple of my own questions. So I'm going to take some liberties to jump in as well.
Great.
So for the group, one of the things that I've experienced is the hybrid environment seems to be the most stressful. And please jump in if you disagree, but like that seems to be the one where people have a lot of time, a lot of issues, because the expectations are different. You have different formats, things of that nature. And frankly, that's just not going away. It's just the reality of it. And there's some certainly positives, but have any of you found, one, I'm curious if you found the same that I have, with that is the most stressful environment. And two, do you have best practices or things that you have just learned? I know this is sort of a new era that have made that more successful and less stressful. So I'm really curious if your experience is similar to mine.
Corey?
Yes, I'm trying to think through how best to answer that. I don't know if Marilyn or Scott, if you want to jump in. Yes, I have definitely found that to be the case as well. I think one of the things, and I think this kind of goes back, Scott, to your question from earlier about kind of techniques of, working in a remote environment, that I fail to do every time, but I always want to do, is not, I mean, partly thinking about, is it really a half-hour meeting or is it an hour meeting? But not scheduling it for the full time. So if it's an hour meeting, only actually scheduling it for 15 minutes, and people have built in time to get up and get a glass of water or use the restroom or whatever it might be. And I fail miserably at that. And then I'm always reminded of it and I want to correct it, and then I fail again. But I think it's a great technique, or starting the meeting at 10 minutes after the hour or something like that, I think is a very smart tool that I've seen.
Yeah, that's so critical. And it is interesting how we continually talk about that and then fail in systems. So we talk about these things and then we don't change our outlook or whatever, we're using to set meetings a certain way, or acknowledge that somebody may be sitting at one chair for hours and hours and hours, and that level of stress, versus having to walk to a boardroom or something, or a meeting room, which gives you at least a little bit of time in between, and people understand if you're behind or you're late. So
I think
managing expectations. Oh, go ahead, Corey.
Oh no, go ahead, Scott, please.
Yeah, I think managing everyone's expectations and being respectful of time is just so helpful. Starting the meetings late, or giving people, letting people out of meetings early so they can get to their next meeting. Those are all really, really good tactics.
mm-hmm.
I think one of the things we learned in COVID, and as we came back from COVID, was even if we had meetings back to back, they might be in different locations. So we still built in time for people, or we had things that made us get up and move around. Where going remote, as Marilyn said, you're in that chair all day long, and being a lot more intentional about building in that time to get up from your seat. I think it's really critical of that nature of how meetings work when we're in person and face to face. They're just very different.
Yeah, we lost all informal time in some ways, except via chat in the middle of meetings. And I think multitasking too has become one of those things that's increased stress, because if you're in front of your screen, you're also getting pop-up things and text messages, and it can really start to tax your ability to focus. And it's a brain thing. It's not a weakness or, something that you can always fight. It's truly too much input.
Yeah, that's super helpful just to get a sense for. And I've heard a couple things that I wanted to call out, but I also want to give everybody kind of the opportunity to just kind of like wrap up with a bow some of your thoughts. But for me, one of my big takeaways is you have to model this behavior for your team. It's just not going to work if you don't model this behavior. I love the idea, and it should be straightforward, but I do love the idea. It's like, hey, listen, because you are available, that doesn't mean that you should be working, and certainly should be working during your working hours. But I think that is one of those things that is really stressful. It's like, you get an email from your boss at 6 or 7 o'clock at night. Should you respond to that? Should you not? So those expectations, I think, are really, really good ones. And then I loved, especially for the dog owners, like dogs are really nice because like you don't have an option, right? Like you have to take them out. But for those of us who aren't the dog owners, I think that's a really good behavior to potentially model. So like those were some of the things that really stood out to me. So really want to flip it back to the group as well. Like what are the things that, as kind of your recap, you really want to make sure people have good takeaways on?
I think to be human and communicate, I think the model thing is really important. And also, if you are a manager or someone who does work, say you've got a staggered family kind of way of dealing with things. And so you have a couple of hours in the evening, and that's how you feel best about going into the next day. You can say to your team, this is how I work. And so if you get something from me, it's because I'm getting it out of my mind, but please don't respond to it until you're back in the office. Or you can put in the email, just needed to get this out. No need to work on it till Monday. I mean, so you can also, if you communicate, then that shows that there's room for different styles too of working. It's like, I'm not setting an expectation that you work after hours. I need to get some things. Or I had a manager too, who would write all of her emails, but then they would come in Monday morning. The things she thought of over the weekend she would do, but she would say, you won't hear from me between 7 on Friday until Monday morning, and I don't expect to hear from you. One time my current president was like, this is President Ulmer not looking for Marilyn Powell on a Friday. So I think it's those kinds of things when I texted him about where I was. So I think that being human, using humor can really help.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Marilyn, because as you started talking, I was thinking about that, kind of the delay of email. I had a colleague who we would shut down between Christmas and New Year's. And she would do some email, but she would set them all delayed. So, that first day back after the winter break might have 17 emails from her. But it was her way of saying, I don't expect anybody else to work. So I'm not going to let you even see them until I come back. I also think that I don't want to downplay the large number of people who in the poll said that budget is a major source of stress. I think particularly as we're talking about enrollment, and we know that enrollment drives so much of the budget, that I think it's very difficult to combat that element of stress because I think that drives a lot of behaviors. They don't want to be the person who's laid off. They want, they are the reason why they feel like they can't step away, why they can't take time off, why they need to at least try to overperform, even though being burned out is going to affect their performances. They are deathly afraid of losing their job. I don't think that we downplay that. And I think that's where it's really making sure that the leadership of the institute, and that it's the president, it's the CFO, are being transparent, but are also talking about it in a human way of how this impacts, knowing that it could lead to layoffs of people, but not trying to strike the fear of God into people of you better work at 300% or you might lose your job. But showing compassion and empathy as they talk about it, but making sure that those leaders are out there and actually talking about it, because they're the ones who ultimately need to be the leader in that area for the entire. Encouraging them.
I agree with you, and it's a shame. I get calls every day from colleges and universities wanting to grow enrollment. I don't get any calls about them. Colleges asking, okay, we know this enrollment cliff is coming, and we know less high school students are attending college. How can we prepare for the decrease in enrollment that 80-90% of these colleges are going to see, especially a lot of the smaller privates. We continue to have boards and presidents putting unbelievable pressure on admissions to bring in more and more students. And when things don't go well, the first thing that they point at is what's wrong in admissions, what's wrong, we're not marketing enough, we're not promoting the school. When institutions today really need to be thinking about right sizing for their institution and what that looks like, and stop putting so much pressure on admissions and marketing. It's really not possible to continue year after year, especially if the realities that we have coming in these next couple of years.
I saw someone
Douglas, you have
talking
any
about-
more questions for the team?
No, well, you know what? I think we're actually kind of like on an interesting roll, because let me go back to the survey and just, I'll say these out loud, but of our survey, the question was, what causes workplace stress? So budget, oh, thank you, Vivica. Budget and staff constraints, huge 48%. So I think you talked to that really well. Lack of training and unclear job expectations, still a good chunk, over a third. Lack of social importance and mentoring, smaller, but still 10%. Lack of resource and technology, almost 20. And the real big one in the room here, imbalanced workload on work-life balance. I think we've done a pretty good job covering sort of the last one, which is great, because that was obviously one of the big poll questions. And we've talked a little bit about budget and staffing constraints. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience and maybe how to solve some of these for the 1/3, which is the lack of training or unclear job expectations.
Well, I can speak to a lot of clients that I do visit. Training is always an issue. Most colleges and universities are so engaged about putting butts in seats and not focusing and having their staff trained. It's so important that you take that time and do that, regardless of, you have other things to do. So putting training in place and making sure your staff is trained. What's the rub against that right now is, before COVID, the average admissions counselor would be there for 24 months. You'd have them for at least 2 cycles, recruitment cycles. When I talk to a lot of admissions directors and VPs, they have 2 or 3 openings at a time, and they're lucky to get 6 months. And I know that the other departments across a lot of these universities and colleges are feeling the same pain, because the directors and the VPs are saying, hey, it's not just admissions, we're seeing this in other areas. So academic advising, it just continues to snowball and carry out. So I think training and taking the time to have training in place, have some of your senior counselors, that is their job to onboard. So having an onboard process, and it's even more important today with how people are changing jobs and how quickly they're moving on.
Yeah, that's a great, and there's no doubt about it. Having someone who, if the average tenure is 6 months or so, there's no doubt that's going to cause stress throughout the rest of the organization. For someone's been there a decade, they don't know who's going to be their next, the next person they're going to rely on, next person on the team. So thanks for sharing that, Scott. That was really insightful.
I think the other thing I'd add to that is I think the biggest piece is definitely for new employees. But I think a lot of times we tend to target training at new people coming in. We forget about people who've been there for a while. So policies change and processes change. And we don't necessarily always tell people in the trenches who are doing the work, and they have to find out about it because they did something wrong or somebody just happens to mention something. And so making sure that we have some kind of built-in process, whether it's just communication or whether it's ongoing training, to let people know when things and how things are different. So that way they're always in the loop on what's happening too.
I'll go back to simplification again. I mean, if you can put it in a cheat sheet or a job aid or assign a more senior person with a little reduced goals to support a new person, so there's one person to go to, and give that more senior person some development by having them mentor someone. Those are always good things to do. And I think people talk about doing more with less. I think we have to do some stop, start, continue. There are things that maybe we're doing that we don't have to do. Go to, what's tried and true and best practices and the rest of it, maybe make a decision about not doing something if you're doing more with less.
I think that's beautiful. And I think that maybe the last point we should end on then is we've talked about what you should do to help address burnout. What should you stop doing to address burnout? And Marilyn, it looks like you're like ready to jump in on that one. So I'll give it to you to start.
But I don't think we think that way. I think we always think about what can we do, and then you realize later that you're doing 80 things because you keep adding, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this. And I think it goes along with Corey's statement about, we don't always go back and say, well, did that work? Or is this policy changed? Have we refreshed everybody? I think we had one thing where we realized we had like 80 pilots going at any given time. It's no longer a pilot because you have, so if your team's trying out different things, help frame some of that, or say, we tried this and it wasn't really working, so let's stop doing that, or let everybody take a look at your day and let's prioritize the things that seem to work and get us toward our goals, and learn about the things that are just maybe superfluous and just extra, and let's stop doing those things, because I think that it's just not in our nature to think about what we stop doing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think involving your team in that process and frontline staff, so that way you're asking them, what is it that you see that really isn't having an impact? I think that helps them feel valued and like a professional, that they're part of the process. I think really goes a long way, and with goodwill and buy-in, but I think it also helps with that, that they're being heard.
I would add too that colleges and universities need to stop asking their staff to do more with less. You can't expect an admissions office, for example, that had traditionally 8 admissions counselors out on the road to bring in a class of 500 with 4 admissions counselors. You can't expect to have a seamless academic advising and onboarding of new students process where you typically had 4 to 6 academic advisors, and now you have 2. It's always been colleges and universities that continually, hey, we're going to have to cut budget, we're going to have to do more with less. That doesn't work. You're just burning out your team. You want to know why people are leaving. You keep on asking them to do more. And I would add to that too is, if someone comes to you and say they can do more, just take that person's salary and we'll split it up between the team. I would resist that at all costs, because that just burns out your entire team, because they have so much on their plate.
No, thank you, everyone. That was fantastic, and really, I think nice place to kind of put a bow on our conversation. Not only all the things you can and should do, but really the things you can also stop doing that help address burnout. So once again, I want to just walk through and thank our panelists here. So we have Scott Rhodes, who is the Senior Vice President of Enrollment Consulting at Echo Delta. Scott, thank you for being our moderator. We have Dr. Marilyn Powell, who's the Vice President of Academic Operations at West Coast University. Thank you for bringing your insight. And last but not least, we have Corey Klassman, who's an independent consultant with a lot of experience in the higher education field. So thank you very much for all being here. And really appreciate our audience jumping into some of these questions that I've kind of pulled from the side as well. So can't thank you enough. And this has been very insightful.
Thank you.